When Judge Amy Coney Barrett mocked Keanu Reeves in front of the Supreme Court, the room laughed until he pulled out a pocket constitution older than her argument. What happened next didn't just silence a justice, it shook the foundation of American law. But why was Keanu even there, and what secret was he hiding? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The envelope looked official, but out of place. Thick cream stock, the seal of the Supreme Court of the United States embossed in gold across the flap. It sat on Keanu Reeves's kitchen counter, untouched, while the kettle whistled faintly in the background. He hadn't expected mail like this. Not today, not ever. For a few seconds, he simply stared at it, unsure whether to open it or throw it away. It had to be a mistake, or a prank, probably some fan mail disguised as a legal document. He picked it up slowly, feeling its unexpected weight in his hands. No return address, only his full name typed neatly across the front. Mr. Keanu Charles Reeves. He sliced the envelope open with the edge of a butter knife, pulled out a single folded sheet, and began reading. By the third line, he was sitting down. The letter was real. The Supreme Court was requesting his presence as amicus curiae, a friend of the court, for oral arguments in an upcoming case on civil forfeiture. They wanted him to appear in person, at the nation's highest judicial bench. His mind reeled. This had to be a mistake. Keanu had written a legal brief, yes, but under a pseudonym? He had no law degree, no formal standing, just years of quiet study and relentless research into a topic that had haunted him for years: property seizures that punished the innocent. He had never intended for anyone to know. The brief wasn't supposed to go anywhere. He had submitted it anonymously, more as a personal act of conscience than an attempt to sway policy. But someone had read it, and someone had been moved enough to trace it back to him. Keanu stood up slowly, heart pounding in his chest. He walked to his bookshelf, pulled out a small, tattered notebook tucked between two volumes on American legal history. The notebook was filled with quotes, observations, annotated passages from the Federalist Papers, and hand-copied letters from early framers of the Constitution. Rosa Valdez's name was scrawled at the top of a dozen pages. He hadn't met her in person. He only knew her story, a 72-year-old woman in Arizona who had lost her home because her nephew had been caught with a gram of marijuana on her property. She had committed no crime. She hadn't even known the nephew was there that day. But the state had seized her house anyway, citing civil forfeiture. It had enraged him. It had hollowed him out. And in between filming and long nights alone in hotel rooms, Keanu had begun researching everything he could about civil forfeiture laws in the United States. Not just the modern cases. He dug into the founding era, into dusty archives and early debates from the very authors of the Constitution. He had spoken with professors at Howard, Yale, and Georgetown, not as a student, but as a man with questions no one seemed to answer publicly. Now the court was asking him to speak, out loud, on record, in front of the very institution that had allowed laws like the one that ruined Rosa's life to stand. Keanu set the letter down carefully on the counter, as if it might detonate if touched again. He stepped outside onto the balcony, eyes drifting across the Los Angeles skyline. It was a clear morning, the kind where everything looked deceptively peaceful. But inside, his thoughts raced. This wasn't just a speaking engagement. It wasn't a charity panel or a university Q&A. This was the Supreme Court of the United States. He knew how it would look, a movie star playing pretend in the highest legal arena. The media would mock it, the pundits would tear it apart. But beneath all that noise, the real question gnawed at him. Was he ready? He had written the brief with care, using originalist arguments and framing it with moral clarity. But speaking it, defending it, would be something else entirely. He'd have to stand in a courtroom where centuries of tradition loomed in every marble column and velvet bench. He'd have to face real justices, like Amy Coney Barrett and Clarence Thomas. And they wouldn't go easy on him just because he had played Neo or John Wick. He returned to his desk, picked up the letter again, and read the last line. Due to the unique nature and impact of your submitted materials, your presence is requested at oral argument as an amicus participant in Henderson v. Department of Justice. He looked down at the briefcase beside his chair. Inside were photocopies of every letter from James Madison he had studied, printouts of forfeiture cases dating back to 1790, and his own annotations in the margins. It wasn't just a hobby. It had become a mission. A quiet one. Until now. He opened his laptop and confirmed the source of the letter. It was real. The clerk who had flagged his brief worked for Justice Sotomayor's chambers. Someone on the inside had taken him seriously. That night, Keanu didn't sleep. He stayed up reading. Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, legal interpretations of the Fifth Amendment, and the early roots of property rights under English common law. He paced the floor. He took notes. He highlighted and underlined. At dawn, he sat on the floor, surrounded by books and yellow legal pads, and made his decision. He would go, not as an actor, not as a name, but as a citizen. He wasn't walking into the court for publicity. He was walking in because no one else would speak for Rosa. No one else had written her name at the top of their brief. 3 days later, he packed lightly. One black suit, one leather briefcase, a single photo of Rosa's boarded-up house, and a pocket constitution with frayed edges and too many bookmarks to count. He took no assistant, no entourage. At the airport, no one recognized him in the early morning haze. He boarded the plane quietly, found his window seat, and stared out as the city shrank beneath him. The plane touched down at Reagan National Airport under gray skies. A light drizzle covered the tarmac, casting everything in a silvery hue. Keanu walked through the terminal unnoticed, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side. No cameras, no crowds, just a man carrying the weight of someone else's injustice. Outside the terminal, a black car waited. It wasn't for him, but he wasn't looking for a ride. He chose the metro instead, Blue Line to Judiciary Square. The closer he got to Capitol Hill, the more surreal it became. Posters of upcoming political events, marble buildings framed in scaffolding, a city full of power dressed in suits and guarded by silence. He stepped off the train, climbed the steps onto the street, and paused. The Supreme Court loomed ahead, tall, cold, magnificent. The words engraved on the building stared back at him like a challenge, equal justice under law. He tightened his grip on the briefcase. Inside was his argument, handwritten and typed, cited and sourced, prepared for any attack. He knew the justices would question everything, his credentials, his knowledge, his presence, but they couldn't erase the truth. He took a deep breath and crossed the plaza. As he walked up the steps, a few law clerks glanced his way, eyebrows raised. One whispered something to another, eyes following him until he disappeared through the heavy oak doors. The marble halls were quiet, cold, echoing. A security officer stopped him at the entrance. Purpose of visit? Keanu reached into his coat pocket and handed over the letter. The guard read it, then looked up slowly. His expression shifted, just slightly. Not recognition, but curiosity. This way, sir. Keanu followed the officer through a long corridor, passing portraits of justices and displays of historic cases. Each step echoed louder than the last. At the end of the hall, a staffer opened a tall wooden door. "Mr. Reeves," the man said, gesturing inside. Keanu stepped into the preparation room. Inside were several chairs, a long table, and a small stack of documents with his name already printed on a placard. Across the room, a young woman, no older than 25, looked up from her laptop. "You really came," she whispered. He nodded, unsmiling. "I read your brief. I've never seen anything like it." Keanu placed his briefcase on the table. "I didn't write it to be seen," he said. "But now that it has been, I'll say what needs to be said." He looked around the room one last time, then sat down, opened his folder, and began reviewing his notes as the weight of what lay ahead settled fully on his shoulders. Tomorrow he would face the court, but today he would prepare, alone, silent, and unshaken. The next morning, Keanu arrived at the Supreme Court building an hour before the security checkpoint opened to the public. The early light hit the marble steps with a soft glow, but nothing about the moment felt warm. The building loomed, indifferent and immense, its columns casting long shadows that seemed to stretch over everything. He stood quietly, briefcase in hand, wearing a plain black suit and polished shoes, waiting like any other citizen. When the doors finally opened, security protocols kicked in. Guards inspected every item with exacting precision. Keanu placed his briefcase on the belt, removed his watch, and stepped through the scanner. No one greeted him. No one even offered a nod of recognition. One of the guards, glancing at his ID, furrowed his brow and asked, "Are you here for a tour?" "No," Keanu said calmly. "I'm here for the oral arguments." The guard looked at him again, this time with less curiosity and more skepticism. Still, the letter spoke for itself. It had the seal, the clearance, the approval. The guard waved him through, though his eyes lingered longer than necessary. As Keanu moved down the hall, whispers followed him. A young law clerk passed by, did a double take, then muttered under his breath, "Is that—" Another clerk chuckled, just loud enough to be heard. "Is he lost? Maybe he's scouting locations for his next courtroom movie." Keanu said nothing. He kept walking, eyes fixed ahead, posture straight, each step echoing softly against the marble floor. He passed busts of former justices and framed displays of historic decisions. The air was cool and sterile. The silence carried judgment more piercing than words. He reached the assigned conference room where participants and observers gathered before the hearing. A tall man in a gray suit leaned against the far wall, sipping coffee from a branded Supreme Court mug. His eyes landed on Keanu, and he didn't bother to hide his surprise. "You've got to be kidding me," the man muttered. Another scholar beside him raised an eyebrow. "Are we doing stunts now? I thought this was the Supreme Court, not Sundance." A few more heads turned. Some stared. Others whispered. One woman frowned, clearly trying to recall if she had seen him in a legal journal or just on a movie screen. Keanu stepped inside, placed his briefcase on the table, and calmly sat down. He opened it, pulled out his pocket constitution, and flipped to a page marked with 3 thin blue tabs. He began scribbling in the margins with a mechanical pencil, eyes focused, expression unreadable. Across the room, a middle-aged man wearing a Georgetown law pin leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "He's serious. Look at his notes." The colleague shrugged. "Serious doesn't mean qualified." Keanu didn't react. He had heard it all before. Not these exact words, but the sentiment. The assumption that someone like him didn't belong here. But he wasn't here for their approval. He was here for Rosa. The next morning, Keanu arrived at the Supreme Court building an hour before the security checkpoint opened to the public. The early light hit the marble steps with a soft glow, but nothing about the moment felt warm. The building loomed, indifferent and immense, its columns casting long shadows that seemed to stretch over everything. He stood quietly, briefcase in hand, wearing a plain black suit and polished shoes, waiting like any other citizen. When the doors finally opened, security protocols kicked in. Guards inspected every item with exacting precision. Keanu placed his briefcase on the belt, removed his watch, and stepped through the scanner. No one greeted him. No one even offered a nod of recognition. One of the guards, glancing at his ID, furrowed his brow and asked, "Are you here for a tour?" "No," Keanu said calmly. "I'm here for the oral arguments." The guard looked at him again, this time with less curiosity and more skepticism. Still, the letter spoke for itself. It had the seal, the clearance, the approval. The guard waved him through, though his eyes lingered longer than necessary. As Keanu moved down the hall, whispers followed him. A young law clerk passed by, did a double take, then muttered under his breath, "Is that?" Another clerk chuckled just loud enough to be heard. "Is he lost? Maybe scouting locations for his next courtroom movie." Keanu said nothing. He kept walking, eyes fixed ahead, posture straight, each step echoing softly against the marble floor. He passed busts of former justices and framed displays of historic decisions. The air was cool and sterile. The silence carried judgment more piercing than words. He reached the assigned conference room where participants and observers gathered before the hearing. A tall man in a gray suit leaned against the far wall, sipping coffee from a branded Supreme Court mug. His eyes landed on Keanu, and he didn't bother to hide his surprise. "You've got to be kidding me," the man muttered. Another scholar beside him raised an eyebrow. "Are we doing stunts now? I thought this was the Supreme Court, not Sundance." A few more heads turned. Some stared. Others whispered. One woman frowned, clearly trying to recall if she had seen him in a legal journal or just on a movie screen. Keanu stepped inside, placed his briefcase on the table, and calmly sat down. He opened it, pulled out his pocket Constitution, and flipped to a page marked with 3 thin blue tabs. He began scribbling in the margins with a mechanical pencil, eyes focused, expression unreadable. Across the room, a middle-aged man wearing a Georgetown law pin leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "He's serious. Look at his notes." The colleague shrugged. Serious doesn't mean qualified. Keanu didn't react. He had heard it all before, not these exact words, but the sentiment. The assumption that someone like him didn't belong here. But he wasn't here for their approval. He was here for Rosa. The doors to the Supreme Court opened just before 10. The line outside had wrapped halfway down First Street, stretching with quiet anticipation. Reporters, students, clerks, and federal observers flooded the gallery. Every seat was taken. Those without passes huddled around portable radios or watched live-stream summaries from the steps outside. Inside, the tension was thick. The justices entered one by one in their black robes. Chief Justice John Roberts took his seat at the center of the bench, flanked by Justices Thomas, Alito, Kagan, Gorsuch, Jackson, and others. Judge Amy Coney Barrett sat with a composed expression, chin slightly raised, pen already in hand. As Chief Justice Roberts called the session to order, the courtroom stilled into a reverent silence. Counsel for the government began. The Solicitor General spoke crisply, defending civil forfeiture practices as necessary tools to deter criminal enterprise and protect national security interests. His argument was clean, technical, and expected. He cited precedent, walked through statutes, and leaned on the court's past ruling. Then came the shift. Roberts looked down the list and said plainly, "Mr. Keanu Reeves, appearing as amicus curiae, you may proceed." A flutter of murmurs echoed across the chamber. In the gallery, heads turned, reporters lifted pens, law students leaned forward. Keanu rose from the second row, walked quietly to the lectern, and placed his worn leather briefcase on the floor beside him. He wore no tie, just a crisp, dark suit. No entourage, no notes in hand. Only a thin, faded book tucked into his coat pocket. Before he could even open his mouth, Barrett spoke. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice clipped and cool, "this is the Supreme Court of the United States, not a movie set." A few people in the gallery chuckled under their breath. Keanu didn't blink. He reached into his coat and slowly pulled out a tattered pocket Constitution, its edges curled from use, filled with post-it notes and faded pencil markings. He laid it on the lectern, opened it to a bookmarked page, and placed his hands gently on either side. He looked up. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm but firm, "this book belongs to the people." Barrett leaned back, her pen pausing just above her legal pad. Chief Justice Roberts glanced at Justice Sotomayor, who offered a slow, neutral nod. Keanu continued, "I'm not here to entertain. I'm not here to lecture. I'm here because this court is hearing a case that could redefine what due process means in the lives of everyday Americans. And I believe, respectfully, that we've drifted far from what the founders intended." He paused just long enough for the room to settle. Then he turned the page. "This," he said, pointing to the text, "is a letter from James Madison, dated January 1788. In it, Madison warns of the danger of governments empowered to seize property without due process." Justice Kagan leaned forward slightly, eyebrows raised. Keanu lifted a high-resolution reproduction of the letter and held it up. "This isn't a quote from a textbook," he said. "This is the actual text Madison wrote to George Nicholas in the lead-up to Virginia's ratification." He began reading aloud, voice steady. "A government allowed to take from the people without proving guilt cannot long call itself free." Gasps stirred in the gallery. Reporters began scribbling furiously. One law clerk in the press box glanced at the bench and saw Justice Jackson nod slowly, her eyes fixed on Keanu. He looked back down at the Constitution in front of him. "This clause, the Fifth Amendment, was never meant to be procedural window dressing," Keanu said. "It was a moral barrier, a line drawn in the sand between a just government and tyranny." Judge Barrett tapped her pen twice, a subtle signal of impatience. "Mr. Reeves," she interrupted, "we are aware of the language. Perhaps you could get to your argument rather than quoting sentimental history." Keanu looked up, not unkindly. "With respect, Your Honor, this court often relies on precedent. I'm asking that we remember origin, not sentiment, foundation." He turned to face the full bench. "Civil forfeiture has become a tool for punishing people who were never convicted, never charged, and in many cases never even warned. Rosa Valdez had no criminal record, no charges filed. Yet her home was seized without trial because of the actions of a relative she hadn't seen in months." Justice Thomas, usually quiet, tilted his head, now watching more closely. Keanu turned another page. "Let's look at precedent. The case of United States v. James Daniel Good, 1993. This court ruled that the government could not seize property in a civil forfeiture case without prior notice and a meaningful opportunity to be heard." He paused. "But today, those protections have eroded. In practice, we've turned exceptions into norms, loopholes into policy. The Constitution is not being followed, it's being bent." Barrett narrowed her eyes. "Are you suggesting this court has failed to uphold the Constitution, Mr. Reeve?" Keanu didn't back away. "I'm suggesting that the law has outpaced its morality, and that this court has the power and the obligation to realign them." For the first time, the entire courtroom was still. No pens moved, no fingers tapped. The silence wasn't empty, it was listening. Keanu placed the Madison letter back in his folder and opened another section of his notes. "I've also included 6 founding JERA documents in my amicus brief, some of them written by Hamilton, others by Edmund Randolph, all warning against the dangers of unchecked seizures." He looked directly at the bench, and none of them envisioned a system where property could be taken without a crime. Barrett folded her hands tightly. "Convenient interpretations, Mr. Reeves," she said coolly. "But what about Bennis v. Michigan? This court upheld the seizure of a vehicle from an innocent spouse. Do you consider that decision a mistake?" Keanu took a breath. "I do," he said plainly. A murmur spread through the gallery. "And I'm not alone. Justice Stevens dissented in that case. He wrote that punishing someone for the actions of another without proof of complicity is incompatible with fundamental justice." Barrett's expression tightened. Keanu reached into his briefcase again, pulled out a laminated chart showing early forfeiture cases from 1789 to 1850. During that period, every single civil forfeiture case involved maritime law, jurisdictional anomalies, or goods in transit. Not homes, not pensions, not personal property of innocent people. He tapped the chart once. We've strayed. The doctrine of in rem forfeiture, originally meant for customs enforcement, is now being used against grandmothers. And it's being upheld. Justice Sotomayor raised her pen. You said earlier that the Constitution is being bent. Would you say that's due to legal evolution or judicial neglect? Keanu turned to her. Both, he replied. But neglect is worse. Because it's a choice? Barrett leaned back. You are not a licensed attorney, Mr. Reeves. No, Your Honor. Then what qualifies you to speak here today? Keanu paused. Not in hesitation, but to let the weight of the moment settle. I'm not here as an expert. I'm here as a citizen. One who has studied the Constitution, listened to those ignored by the system, and carried their stories into a room they could never enter themselves. His voice softened, but never wavered. I'm not here to win. I'm here to be heard. The room held its breath. Then Justice Kagan whispered something to Justice Gorsuch. Neither looked away from Keanu. He closed the Constitution gently, laid his hand over it, and said one last thing. If this case goes the way of precedent, then Rosa Valdez and those like her will remain invisible. But if this court chooses courage over comfort, foundation over fear, we can remind the country that this document, he tapped the cover once, still belongs to all of us. Chief Justice Roberts cleared his throat but didn't speak. The silence said more than words. Keanu gave a respectful nod to the bench, gathered his notes, and stepped away from the lectern. In the gallery, someone exhaled audibly. Justice Barrett didn't move, but her eyes followed him as he returned to his seat. The court had expected a performance. What they got instead was a reckoning. Keanu stepped back toward the lectern, having been invited to continue his amicus remarks by Chief Justice Roberts. He opened a slim folder and carefully pulled out a series of documents, each one encased in protective plastic sleeves, their ink faded but readable. Your Honors, he began, the founders were not ambiguous on the relationship between property and liberty. They did not see one as separate from the other. They believed property was an extension of self, a boundary the government should only cross with proof, process, and purpose. He held up the first page. This is a letter written by John Adams in December 1775. He wrote, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, anarchy and tyranny commence." A wave of stillness swept over the chamber. Every seat in the gallery remained upright, still. Even the junior clerks seemed to stop breathing for a beat. Keanu continued, "And yet, we now live in a country where a woman like Rosa Valdez can lose her home for a crime she didn't commit, for which she was never tried, never charged. Her only mistake was proximity to another person's wrongdoing. That is not liberty. That is sanctioned abandonment." Justice Jackson leaned forward. She didn't say a word, but her eyes didn't leave his face. Keanu laid Adams' letter back in the folder and lifted another document. This is Edmund Randolph's address to the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He warned of a government power which seizes from the innocent with no demand of guilt and dares call it lawful. Barrett shifted in her seat, flipping a page on her notes, though she didn't seem to be reading them. Keanu looked back at the bench. I recognize that the court is constrained by precedent. But I submit to you today that precedent is not a shield for injustice. It is a tool, one that must be recalibrated when it starts cutting in the wrong direction. He then placed both hands flat on the lectern. I've spent 2 years compiling every civil forfeiture case from 1789 to 1850. What I found was sobering. In all early cases, forfeiture was applied only in contexts where the property itself had evaded jurisdiction, such as foreign vessels violating customs law. Never homes, never pensions, never lives. Barrett's pen tapped against her pad once, then stopped. She looked up. Mr. Reeves, she said pointedly, "You're not trained in law." Keanu paused, then met her gaze with quiet calm. "No, Your Honor, I'm not trained in law, but I'm trained in justice." The words didn't shout. They didn't echo. But somehow, they landed with more weight than any legal citation. There were no scoffs, no chuckles this time, only silence. Justice Gorsuch rested his chin on one hand, watching intently. Justice Sotomayor leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed but engaged. Keanu turned another page. When I began researching this topic, I didn't do it from a place of theory. I did it from a place of anger, of frustration. I couldn't understand how the same Constitution that protected speech, religion, and voting could be interpreted to allow the government to strip a person's home away without convicting them of anything. He opened a new sleeve and held it up. This is an original scan of a letter from James Madison to Thomas Jefferson in 1792. In it, Madison wrote, "A power over a man's subsistence is a power over his will." He let that line hang in the air. What greater subsistence does a person have than the roof over their head? He placed the letter down gently, then looked up at the bench. And so I ask myself, if Madison and Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton saw what we're doing today, would they recognize it as constitutional? Or would they see it as a betrayal of their deepest fears? Justice Jackson finally spoke. "Mr. Reeves, I understand your argument is rooted in original intent, but how do you propose the court balance that intent with the complexities of modern enforcement needs?" Keanu nodded, as though he had been waiting for that very question. "I propose we return to the foundational principles, that due process must mean more than bureaucratic formality, that property cannot be taken from the innocent without a meaningful burden of proof, that law enforcement cannot profit from the people they claim to protect." He took out a chart, columns and rows, detailing over 50 cases across 10 states, all involving innocent owners. "In these cases," he said, "homes were seized for the crimes of sons, cousins, tenants, even for accusations never proven. The property was held indefinitely or auctioned, and the owners never reimbursed. If that is constitutional, then the Constitution no longer defends the people. It defends the process." He paused again. "I audited law courses at Howard University. I sat in the back row, week after week, listening to constitutional scholars debate the limits of state power. I didn't raise my hand. I wasn't enrolled. But I listened. I read. I returned every night to the Library of Congress and pored over volumes others had long forgotten. The murmurs in the gallery were almost imperceptible. Words like meticulous and relentless passed from person to person. Keanu continued, "I am not here to rewrite the law. I'm here to remind this court what the law was always supposed to do." Barrett shifted again. A reporter whispered into a recorder, "He's not just prepared, he's lethal." Keanu lifted one final document from his folder and held it before the court. "This," he said, "is the handwritten margin of a draft version of the Fifth Amendment. It's not taught in classrooms, it's not quoted in opinions, but it exists." He held it up. In the margin, Madison scribbled the phrase, "security against arbitrary forfeiture." The final version didn't include those exact words, but the intention remained. He looked directly at Barrett. "I know I don't wear robes. I don't sit behind that bench. I haven't passed the bar or written in the law reviews. But I have read every word the founders left us. And I've walked with the people this system forgets." Barrett opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her pen hovered above her paper. Keanu continued, "This is not about me. This is not about appearance. This is about a 72-year-old woman who lost everything because she trusted the same system I was raised to believe in. And if this court allows that to continue, then it is not enforcing the Constitution, it is abandoning it." Justice Kagan leaned forward. "Mr. Reeves, in your view, what is the single most important principle this court must reaffirm?" Keanu didn't hesitate. That due process is not a loophole, it's a promise. He stepped back from the lectern and let the silence settle. The courtroom remained still. Even the reporters stopped typing. For a brief moment, the Supreme Court of the United States felt less like a courtroom and more like a reckoning. Keanu gathered his papers, nodded once to the justices, and returned to his seat. Barrett sat motionless, her hands folded tightly. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence spoke volumes. The gallery shifted, slight movements, quiet glances, the sense that something rare had just occurred. Justice Jackson whispered something to her clerk. Justice Gorsuch wrote a single line on his notepad. Roberts tapped his fingers once against the wood, then stopped. The room didn't applaud. It couldn't. But the air had changed, and everyone inside knew it. History wasn't being argued. It was being made. Keanu stepped forward again, this time without papers in hand. He placed his fingertips on the lectern and looked at the justices with steady eyes. "I've spoken about constitutional origin," he said, "about precedent, about letters and law. But now, if the court permits, I'd like to speak of something older than all of that." No one interrupted. He pulled a folded page from the inside of his jacket. It was weathered, printed from a scan, and heavily annotated in pencil. "This is from Thomas Jefferson," he said. "A letter he wrote in 1787 to William Stevens Smith. In it, Jefferson argued that liberty cannot exist without a citizenry that feels its moral weight." Keanu read the line slowly. "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." He paused, then added, "We've all heard that quote, but we often miss what comes next in his writings." Jefferson continued, stating that liberty is not only a right, it is a burden that must be carried with empathy, or it collapses into oppression. He looked up. "When we forget that liberty is not a legal abstraction but a lived experience, we allow laws to become tools of harm." He turned toward the bench, his voice softening. "Rosa Valdez never studied law. She never wrote to her representatives. She never carried a protest sign. She simply lived her life, baking for her grandkids, reading her Bible, sweeping the front porch." He reached into his folder and removed a photograph. It showed Rosa's home, boarded up and stripped of color, its window frames splintered. This is what was left behind after her house was seized. No charges filed, no day in court. Just a letter, a lock, and silence. He set the photo down on the lectern, facing the justices. "This isn't a hypothetical. This is the real consequence of civil forfeiture when it's applied without empathy. The law may have been followed in form, but not in spirit. And the founders warned us that this is exactly what would happen if power went unchecked." The gallery was silent. Even the press box had paused. No typing, no scribbling. Barrett shifted. "Mr. Reeves," she said, more sharply than before, "you seem to be conflating the emotional with the constitutional. This court is bound to the law, not the feelings it may provoke." Keanu turned his head slowly to face her. "To respect, Your Honor," he replied. "The founders didn't separate the two. They bled for both." The words landed like a bell tolling through marble. No one laughed this time, not even a scoff. Roberts stopped writing. Justice Jackson leaned forward, her eyes no longer curious, but fixed. Keanu continued, "The emotional weight of liberty is not an invention of modern rhetoric. It is embedded in our founding texts." He flipped to a new page in his notes and read from a 1789 speech by George Washington to Congress. "Laws made without regard for the human condition will not endure. They may restrain, but they will not inspire." Keanu raised his eyes again. "And yet, civil forfeiture restrains without trial. It punishes without conviction. It seizes property from the elderly, the poor, the disconnected, and calls that justice." He took another breath. In the archives at the Library of Congress, I found dozens of early American sermons, legal essays, and pamphlets. They were not dry legal theory. They were pleas, emotional, moral pleas, to build a nation that remembered its people. He tapped the lectern once. Today we use the law like a wall, but it was built to be a shield. Barrett did not respond. Keanu walked them through one of those sermons next, quoting Reverend Samuel Cooper, who addressed Massachusetts lawmakers in 1775. No nation may call itself free while its law breaks bread with the powerful and steals from the table of the weak. He paused. Those words were spoken during a time of revolution, but they apply just as much to the quiet theft of a grandmother's home as to the seizure of liberty from a colonist. Justice Alito raised a brow but said nothing. Keanu opened another sleeve and pulled out a chart. These are civil forfeiture cases from the last 5 years. 92% involved properties valued under $50,000. 71% affected individuals below the national median income. He pointed to the figures. And in nearly half of those cases, no criminal conviction followed, just property taken, often sold, rarely returned. He paused again, letting the numbers settle. Justice isn't abstract when you're the one left holding an eviction notice, when your fridge is empty, when your family photos are sitting in an auction lot. Barrett shifted again, this time leaning back, arms folded. "You're walking a fine line, Mr. Reeves," she said. "This court does not decide cases based on tears." Keanu nodded. "No, Your Honor, but we have a duty to ensure the law doesn't ignore them either." He stepped to the side of the lectern, lifted the photo of Rosa again, and turned it slightly. "This isn't about reinterpreting the Constitution," he said. "It's about remembering what it was written to protect." The lights in the chamber seemed sharper. No one moved. A single cough broke the silence from the upper balcony. Even the guards at the door were listening now. Keanu lowered the photo and returned it to his folder. "When we talk about the Constitution," he said, "we talk about balance, power versus freedom, order versus chaos. But there's a piece we forget: compassion. And not the soft kind. The kind that stands up. The kind that draws lines in the sand and says, 'Not this. Not anymore.'" He took one step closer to the bench. "I do not stand here asking this court to feel sorry for Rosa Valdez. I stand here asking that we stop making her invisible, that we stop writing laws that forget people exist on the other side of them." Justice Thomas tilted his head. Justice Kagan leaned in and whispered something to Justice Sotomayor. Keanu pressed on. "I am not here as an attorney, I am here as a witness, to the gap between what the Constitution says and how it's lived. And I'm asking, quietly, clearly, that we close that gap." He picked up a final letter, folded and creased from repeated reading. This was written by John Jay, our first Chief Justice. He wrote, "The law may be blind, but those who apply it must not be." Keanu looked up. "Today, I ask this court to open its eyes, to see Rosa, to see the working families who lose what they build because they are too poor to fight, to see the distance between liberty and legality." Barrett said nothing. Her jaw tightened, but she did not speak. And in that silence, Keanu lowered the folder, placed it back into his briefcase, and returned to the lectern with nothing in his hands. "This is not a performance," he said. "This is an appeal, not just to precedent, not just to the law, but to the conscience of the highest court in the land." He nodded once. Then he returned to his seat. The chamber remained silent. Justice Roberts finally moved. He set his pen down, folded his hands, and looked out over the bench, but did not speak. No one did. For a long moment, the entire courtroom was still, frozen, not by fear, but by clarity. Keanu Reeves had just done what few thought possible. He had brought the founders' voices back into the room, and with them, the weight of what justice is supposed to feel like. Not cold, not detached, were real, alive, and watching. Judge Amy Coney Barrett tapped her pen once, then twice, before lifting her eyes to meet Keanu's. Her voice was sharp, meant to reset the room. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "you speak eloquently, but you conveniently ignore this court's own precedent. Bennis v. Michigan, 1996. This court upheld the civil forfeiture of a vehicle jointly owned by an innocent woman. Her husband used it for a criminal act, and yet her claim of ignorance was denied. That is binding law." The gallery murmured. Reporters who had paused now resumed typing. Keanu didn't move. He reached calmly into his briefcase, pulled out a folded set of papers and placed them neatly on the lectern. "I'm aware of Bennis, Your Honor," he said, "and with full respect to this court's history, that decision was a mistake." Barrett's eyebrows rose. Keanu continued. "In Bennis, the majority ruled that an innocent co-owner's property could be forfeited even without her knowledge or consent, but that decision was 5-4. And in his dissent, Justice Stevens wrote the following. He glanced down at the page. "A rule that permits the government to punish an innocent citizen without compensation is not only unjust, it is unworthy of our legal tradition." He paused, let the words hang. Justice Stevens believed then what many Americans still believe now, that the government should not punish people for what they did not do. Justice Kagan leaned forward slightly. Keanu flipped the page and held up the full dissent. This wasn't emotional reasoning, it was constitutional analysis. He argued that the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process and just compensation must apply, even in civil forfeiture proceedings. Because justice without fairness is not justice at all. Barrett shifted in her seat. She opened her mouth, but Keanu spoke again, gently, not forcefully. Justice Stevens warned that if we remove fairness from forfeiture, we give the state too much power with too little accountability. He turned another page, and I would like to add to that with a letter, an obscure one, written by James Madison in April of 1791. He held up a parchment facsimile with delicate handwriting fading into sepia. In this letter, Madison wrote, "A law unmoored from mercy becomes tyranny with a gavel. It is not the majesty of law that keeps it just, but the humility with which it is enforced." Silence. A single reporter in the press box dropped her pen. Keanu looked up. "Mercy isn't weakness, Your Honors. It's wisdom, the kind that remembers a constitution was never meant to be a weapon, but a covenant." Barrett blinked, her lips parting slightly, as if caught off guard, but she recovered quickly. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice now colder, "are you suggesting that this court's adherence to its own rulings is tyrannical?" Keanu met her eyes. "No, Your Honor, I'm suggesting that when the law forgets the people it's meant to protect, tyranny is no longer theoretical, it's lived." Barrett straightened her spine and narrowed her gaze. "This court does not operate on emotional metaphor, Mr. Reeves." Keanu didn't flinch. "I agree," he said, "which is why I came prepared with data, precedent, original documents, and written dissent. But I also came with something else this court seems increasingly uncomfortable acknowledging. Human consequence." There was a faint shift in the gallery. A single law student at the back, barely older than 20, nodded quietly. Barrett crossed her arms. "You seem to believe," she said, "that standing at that lectern grants you moral superiority." Keanu shook his head once. "I don't stand here for grandness, Your Honor. I stand for Rosa." The words landed with no volume, but undeniable force. Her house was taken because someone else made a mistake. She was never tried, never heard. Her home gone, her dignity ignored. He gestured gently toward the bench. This court could have heard her, but it didn't. "So I am." Justice Roberts looked up briefly, then back down at his notes, unmoving. Keanu continued, his voice steady. "When the law allows the government to take property from someone who never committed a crime, who never even stood accused, and we justify it because precedent says we can, then we are no longer practicing law. We are practicing convenience." He opened another file from his folder and handed a copy to the clerk, who quickly distributed it to the bench. These are documented cases from Michigan, Alabama, and Arizona, 3 states where individuals have lost property under forfeiture statutes without a single criminal charge. Some of these cases involve the seizure of entire homes, one of them for a tenant's unopened package left on the porch. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, reading the top page. Keanu allowed the room to absorb it before speaking again. Most of the victims of these cases are working-class Americans. Many are elderly, some don't speak fluent English. Almost all lack the legal resources to fight back. Barrett didn't respond. She tapped her pen again, more out of habit than control. Keanu's tone lowered. "If precedent leads us here," he said, "then precedent must be challenged." He turned toward the gallery. "Justice Stevens once wrote that our Constitution survives not because it is perfect, but because we dare to ask it hard questions." He looked back to Barrett. "And today's question is this: do we continue to protect a doctrine that allows the government to hurt the innocent simply because we've done so before?" Barrett's mouth tightened. "Be careful, Mr. Reeves," she said. "You're implying that this court has become an accomplice to injustice." Keanu paused, then answered, "I'm not implying it. I'm asking you to prevent it." Barrett glanced sideways at Chief Justice Roberts, but he didn't intervene. Her shoulders stiffened. She leaned slightly forward, tone clipped. "What you're doing is not advocacy, Mr. Reeves. It's theater." Keanu took a deep breath. Not defensive, just grounded. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Theater ends when the curtain falls." But Rosa's story didn't end when her house was taken. It kept going. She moved into a shelter. She lost her medication. Her grandchildren had to be separated. That wasn't a script. That was real. The courtroom held its breath. "You say this is theater because I speak with emotion," he continued. "But law without emotion is machinery without a driver. It may move, but it does not steer." Justice Jackson turned to her clerk and scribbled something quickly. Even Justice Alito, whose posture had been rigid, now looked more reflective. Keanu stepped back slightly. "Justice Stevens saw the cracks in Bennis. Madison saw them in 1791. I see them now. But the real question is, does this court?" He let the silence linger, heavy but not confrontational. He picked up a small bound copy of his amicus brief. "In this document I cited 43 sources, 18 Supreme Court cases, 6 founding year writings. I did not come here to challenge your authority. I came here because no one else would carry Rosa's name into this room." He tapped the cover once. "And if that means you label me dramatic, then so be it. But I would rather be dismissed for caring too much than respected for saying too little." A hum of agreement stirred in the gallery. Barrett looked down at her notes, no longer speaking. Keanu stepped back again, folding his papers. "Justice is not upheld by tradition alone," he said. "It is upheld by truth. And truth, even when inconvenient, belongs in this courtroom." He paused. "Especially in this courtroom." Chief Justice Roberts glanced across the bench, eyes resting briefly on each justice. Still, he said nothing. But something had shifted. Barrett didn't respond. For the first time since Keanu began speaking, she had no immediate words to offer. The air was different now. Heavier, slower, but clearer. Keanu returned to his seat, his footsteps measured, his expression unchanged. The gallery didn't move. They didn't have to, because even without a ruling, everyone in that room knew what had just occurred. The Supreme Court had been challenged, not by a scholar, not by a senator, but by a man carrying a pocket constitution and a woman's stolen story. Keanu returned to the hotel just before sunset. The city was buzzing. The streets near the Capitol were choked with news vans, satellite dishes, and reporters holding microphones to crowds who had begun gathering outside the Supreme Court's steps. By the time he stepped into the elevator, his phone had already vibrated with over 30 missed calls and dozens of unread texts. He didn't check them. The hallway was quiet. Room 812 sat at the end, away from the elevators, away from everything. He stepped inside, dropped his briefcase on the desk, and locked the door behind him. On the television, muted news coverage flashed images of the courtroom. His face appeared on split screens beside headlines reading, "Hollywood Star Challenges SCOTUS and Constitutional Showdown. Reeves versus Barrett." Another banner crawled across the bottom. "Has Reeves redefined legal advocacy?" He turned it off. The silence returned. Outside the window, Washington glowed under a wash of amber lights. Keanu pulled a chair toward the desk and sat. Then he opened the drawer and removed a single photo he had been keeping there since his arrival. It was Rosa's house. Boarded up, paint peeling, the front gate padlocked, a place that once held birthday parties, family dinners, and prayers whispered before bed. He stared at the photo. Everything they had said today, about precedent, about property, about legal definitions, none of it had protected this woman. Her home had been taken by a law that was supposed to serve her, and now that very system was defending its actions as routine, acceptable, constitutional. He set the photo down and rubbed his temples. For a moment, he wondered if he had said too much, pushed too hard, given them a reason to dismiss him as emotional or reckless. But then the memory returned. The sound of Rosa's story being told in a room that had ignored her for years, and the way the courtroom, even in its silence, had listened. His phone buzzed again. He picked it up and scrolled through the headlines. Founders would clap. Reeves, Madison would nod. Justice is human. Some were supportive, others mocked. One tweet read, "Keanu Reeves just walked into SCOTUS and made half the bench rethink their legacy." Another said, "I never cared about civil forfeiture until today." And one, simple and raw. He didn't sound like an actor. He sounded like someone who gave a damn. Keanu set the phone down. Then, a knock at the door. He looked at the clock. It was after 9. Cautiously, he opened the door to find a young woman in her early 20s. She looked familiar. "I'm Maya," she said softly. "Rosa's granddaughter." Keanu blinked, stunned, then stepped aside to let her in. Maya stepped into the room slowly, holding a small envelope in her hands. She glanced around, uncertain, but Keanu gestured for her to sit. "I didn't know you were in D.C., he said. "I flew in this morning," she replied, settling into the chair across from him. "I watched the hearing from the public line. We waited 6 hours in the rain, but I got a seat." Keanu nodded. He didn't ask what she thought. He didn't need to. She reached into the envelope and pulled out a folded photograph. "She wanted you to have this." She handed it over. It was a new photo. Rosa, standing in front of the empty lot where her house once stood. She was wearing her church dress, holding a worn Bible in her left hand. Her face was lined by age, but her expression was steady. Brave. Behind her, a chain-link fence surrounded what used to be her home. Keanu stared at it, then gently traced his fingers over the edges of the picture. "Sheem said you made her feel like a citizen again," Maya said. "She said you spoke for her better than she could have ever spoken for herself." Keanu didn't speak at first. His throat tightened. He looked down again at Rosa's photo, then back at the one on the desk. One showed a home taken, the other, a woman standing tall, despite it. "I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Not today, not until now." "You are," Maya replied. "You were the first one who didn't treat her like a statistic, the first one who didn't turn away when she told her story." Keanu nodded once. He folded the new photo and placed it beside his notes. "Tell her I won't stop." Maya hesitated, then said, "She knows. She told me to tell you. No matter what happens tomorrow, she already won." He exhaled, slowly. They sat in silence for a while, the low hum of the hotel's air conditioning filling the space. Eventually, Maya stood. "I should go. Early morning for you." Keanu walked her to the door. Before she left, she turned and added, "Barrett didn't like what you said today. I saw her face. She'll come at you hard tomorrow." He nodded. I'm ready." After she left, the room felt different. Still quiet, but not lonely. Not anymore. Keanu poured a glass of water, sat down again at the desk, and opened his notes one last time. He didn't need to revise anything. He just wanted to see it all again. Every citation, every handwritten line, every name listed under wrongful forfeiture cases. His phone buzzed once more. This time, the message came from an unknown number. "Barrett won't hold back tomorrow." He stared at the screen, then typed one sentence. "Neither will I." Keanu placed the phone face down and leaned back in his chair. The message didn't scare him. It clarified things. The courtroom tomorrow would be different. Barrett would not be silent. She would not hesitate. If she had felt embarrassed today, tomorrow she would retaliate. With sharper questions, colder logic, and a deliberate push to remind him who the court belonged to. But he wasn't walking in there for himself. He picked up the photo of Rosa again and stared at her expression. She looked like someone who had lost much but refused to lose herself. He thought back to the first time he read about her case. A 2-paragraph article buried in the back pages of a local legal journal. No photos. No outrage. Just the cold facts of property seized due to a relative's arrest. No charges filed against Rosa. No restitution. No public outcry. It wasn't fair. At worst, it was normal. He had started researching that night. Stayed up until dawn. Then again the next day, and the next, until his apartment floor had become a map of case law, founding documents, and notes scrawled in longhand. No one had asked him to do it. No one had paid him. But he couldn't walk away. And now, he was here. He folded the photo of Rosa carefully and slid it into the front pocket of his briefcase. Then he opened his Constitution to the final page and wrote a single note in the margin. Beside the words, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation," he wrote, "Not anymore." Then he closed the book. Outside the window, DC moved on. Cars passed, lights blinked in distant windows. But in his room, it was still, almost sacred. He sat down on the bed, not to sleep, but to rest. One last night before everything changed. He didn't rehearse, he didn't revise. He already knew what he would say. The truth doesn't need rewriting. He turned off the lights. The city dimmed. And somewhere, in a small room in Arizona, Rosa Valdez was watching the news with a quiet smile, knowing that for the first time in her life, someone had carried her name into the highest court in the country. She wasn't invisible anymore. And Keanu Reeves wasn't just walking into court tomorrow. He was walking into history. By the time Keanu arrived at the Supreme Court the next morning, the line outside stretched for blocks. Some people had camped out overnight. Students clutched pocket constitutions. Activists held signs quoting his words from the day before. Inside, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. Not a single seat remained empty. The tension in the air was unmistakable. Keanu entered through the side entrance, his briefcase in one hand, his posture calm, focused. No entourage, no sound beyond the hum of anticipation. As he walked down the center aisle toward his seat, Judge Amy Coney Barrett watched him closely. Her expression gave nothing away. Calculated, cold, unreadable. The Chief Justice called the session to order. Counsel finished their final remarks for the government. Then Roberts looked toward Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, you may proceed with your rebuttal." Keanu stood and walked to the lectern. He opened his briefcase slowly and removed a single photograph, the same one Maya had delivered the night before. He held it up before the court. "This is Rosa Valdez," he began, his voice firm but soft. "This is who the law affects." He placed the photo on the lectern and turned to the bench. "Yesterday, I spoke about foundation, about what the Constitution says. Today, I want to speak about what it must do." He pulled out a folded document from his folder and laid it flat. The current model of civil forfeiture allows property to be seized without sufficient evidence, oversight, or accountability. I propose a new framework. 3 criteria that must be met before any property can be lawfully taken from a private citizen. He paused and lifted his gaze to meet the eyes of each justice. First, owner knowledge. There must be clear, demonstrated evidence that the property owner had actual knowledge of the crime being committed. Second, substantial connection. The property must have played a direct, material role in the commission of that crime, not incidental, not speculative. Third, public interest justification. The seizure must serve a legitimate, narrowly tailored public purpose. Revenue generation is not sufficient. Justice Barrett leaned back slightly, narrowing her eyes. Keanu went on. This test would not weaken enforcement. It would strengthen the moral legitimacy of the state's power to confiscate. Because when power respects fairness, it earns trust. Justice Kavanaugh interrupted. Mr. Reeves, did you develop this framework on your own? Keanu nodded without hesitation. Yes, Your Honor. I spent 2 years at the Library of Congress, reviewing early American legal proceedings, legislative notes, and archived property case law. I consulted with constitutional scholars. I audited classes at Howard. I asked questions most people weren't asking. Justice Kavanaugh pressed further. And you weren't enrolled, not paid, not cited? No, Your Honor, Keanu answered. Unpaid, unaccredited, but committed. There was a subtle but unmistakable shift in the courtroom. Justice Kagan looked up from her notes and locked eyes with Keanu. Justice Sotomayor rested her chin on her hand, listening intently. Even Justice Thomas, often silent, leaned slightly forward. Barrett shifted in her seat. Keanu continued. I'm not here because I believe the law is broken. I'm here because I believe it's drifting, slowly, quietly, away from the people it was written to protect. He held up his own annotated copy of the Constitution, its edges frayed, tabs and sticky notes poking out in every direction. This book, he said, was never meant to stay locked behind glass or spoken only by those with degrees. It was written in plain language so that ordinary people could know when something had gone wrong. He opened to a specific page and tapped the Fifth Amendment. It says no person shall be deprived of property without due process of law. That line isn't qualified. It doesn't say unless they're poor. It doesn't say unless it's civil forfeiture. It says no person. He lowered the book. We either believe those words or we don't. Justice Jackson spoke next. Mr. Reeves, the court has been presented with policy proposals before. What makes this different? Keanu looked at her without flinching. Because this didn't come from a think tank. It came from a kitchen table. From families like Rosa's. From nights where people stare at empty walls where their homes used to be and wonder what country they actually live in. He turned to the gallery. It came from listening to those we don't usually hear from. Justice Alito scribbled something, then looked up, curious but silent. Barrett's voice cut through the stillness. Mr. Reeves, this court cannot be swayed by public sympathy. Keanu turned back to her. I'm not asking for sympathy, he said. I'm asking for standards. He walked one step closer to the lectern. When we allow laws to survive simply because they're old, not because they're just, we become caretakers of decay, and the Constitution was not meant to rot in our hands. Barrett's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. Her pen, which had been tapping moments earlier, now rested motionless on her notes. Keanu looked to the Chief Justice next. I've read every argument in this court's history on forfeiture. I've seen the split decisions, the hesitations, the legal gymnastics. He weighs the document he had written himself. What I offer isn't perfect, but it's rooted in truth and in the belief that no citizen should lose their home, their savings, their future without a fair fight. He nodded once. 3 parts: owner knowledge, substantial connection, public interest. If we can't meet that bar, we should not be in the business of taking. The courtroom was silent again. Keanu returned the photo of Rosa to his briefcase. He closed his book, picked up his pages, and said one final thing. Laws are written by people, but justice is written by what we do with them. Then he stepped back. Every eye in the room followed him. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't grandstanded, but somehow he had changed the temperature of the room. Even Judge Barrett could feel it. There was a long pause after Keanu returned to his seat. The courtroom sat in a dense, thoughtful silence. Pages were no longer turning. Reporters weren't typing. Even the gallery had stilled, hanging on what might come next. Then Judge Amy Coney Barrett leaned forward, her tone sharp, clipped, as if trying to slice through the air. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "do you believe celebrities should influence constitutional interpretation?" The question hung there, heavy, aggressive, a challenge not just to his argument, but to his presence. Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked directly at her, thoughtful, respectful, but unshaken. Then he rose again, slowly. "I don't," he said. A flicker of triumph flashed in Barrett's eyes, until he continued. "I don't believe celebrities should influence constitutional interpretation. I believe citizens should." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. He stepped forward again, just one pace, as if anchoring himself in the heart of the room. "The Constitution is not a symbol, it's a guide, and it was written to be read by all of us. If only a select few can interpret it, then it's not a promise. It's a contract we never signed." Barrett opened her mouth slightly, but didn't respond. Keanu's voice grew firmer, not louder, just clearer. "I'm not standing here as an actor. I'm not standing here to perform. I'm standing here because a woman lost her home and no one would listen. So I listened, I read, I studied, I spent 2 years trying to understand how this could happen in the country I love." He looked toward Justice Jackson. "I don't think you need a law degree to recognize injustice." Then to Justice Thomas. "You don't need a bench to hold truth." And finally back to Barrett. "You just need a voice you're not afraid to use." Barrett's expression had not changed, but her stillness now felt different. It was no longer composed. It was tense, defensive. Keanu's voice didn't shake. "I'm not a lawyer. I never claimed to be. I'm a citizen, one who won't be silenced just because I don't fit into a category someone else finds comfortable." There was a beat of silence, and then it happened. From the back of the courtroom, a young man in a college hoodie, no older than 20, clapped, just once. It echoed awkwardly through the marble chamber. Security moved quickly, a firm hand raised toward him to signal silence. He stopped, embarrassed, but it was too late. The wave had started. Someone else cleared their throat, louder than necessary. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes. The energy in the room had changed. Barrett leaned back in her chair. Her jaw tightened slightly, her grip on the pen in her hand more deliberate now. Justice Sotomayor slowly lowered her glasses and looked over them, her gaze steady but thoughtful. Justice Thomas was still scribbling, and Justice Kagan leaned toward her microphone but said nothing, just watching. The moment was no longer about arguments. It was about presence. And Barrett, she knew she had lost something that couldn't be measured in citations or case law. She hadn't just lost the momentum, she had lost the room. Barrett tried to recover. She leaned forward, trying once more to regain control of the narrative. "So, Mr. Reeves, what exactly do you propose we do? Rewrite every precedent you personally find unjust?" Keanu didn't flinch. He stepped forward again, calmly. "No, Your Honor. I propose we apply the Constitution to the people it was written for, not the ones who can afford the best representation, not the ones with the loudest voices, just people, ordinary, vulnerable, often forgotten people." He paused, then added softly, "Like Rosa." Barrett scoffed slightly under her breath. Sympathy does not equal legality, she said sharply. Keanu tilted his head. No, but legality without sympathy becomes cruelty. There was a subtle gasp from somewhere in the gallery. Another pen stopped moving. He turned to the rest of the bench, addressing them collectively now. Precedent matters. But conscience does too. This court has reversed itself over time when it found that precedent had drifted too far from justice. Brown v. Bergen's Board of Education. Gideon v. Wainwright. Obergefell. Those weren't mistakes, they were corrections. Justice Gorsuch looked up at the mention of those cases. Keanu continued, "This is not a partisan issue, it's not even a legal abstraction, it's about the heartbeat of the law, its human cost." He reached back and tapped the photo of Rosa, still sitting in front of his notes. She had no criminal record, no charges. She paid taxes, volunteered at her church, and the system took her home because of a distant relative's mistake. That's not justice. That's bureaucracy with teeth. Barrett seemed ready to interrupt again, but this time the Chief Justice subtly raised a hand, just enough to signal restraint. Keanu looked to the ceiling briefly, then dropped his gaze back to the bench. "I didn't ask to be here, but I'm here because when the law drifts away from the people, it needs someone, not with status, but with will, to pull it back." He reached into his folder one last time and pulled out a small, folded page. It was yellowed with age. "I found this in the Library of Congress archives," he said. "A private letter from James Madison to a friend in 1792. He wrote, 'When the law becomes the tool of the powerful, and the powerless are told to wait, a republic begins to forget why it was born.'" The room fell into complete silence. Even the ceiling fans seemed quieter. Keanu folded the page again and placed it beside Rosa's photo. Then he looked at each justice, one by one. "Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for letting Rosa's voice echo in this room." He turned, gathered his papers, and returned to his seat. The courtroom remained still. Justice Barrett sat unmoving. Her fingers rested on her pen, but she no longer wrote. Her eyes stayed fixed on the photograph at the lectern, as if she were trying not to see it, and failing. Whatever case she had hoped to make through doubt, through distance, through discrediting, was done. She had tried her last strike, and the answer she got wasn't defiance. It was dignity. The marble steps of the Supreme Court had become a spectacle. Within minutes of the session's end, the building was surrounded. News vans clogged the curbs. Satellite dishes rose like steel flowers. Cameramen rushed to get set. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed against metal barricades. Inside, chaos echoed outward. Outside, a tidal wave of public reaction surged. Chants broke out from a growing crowd of students, activists, and curious onlookers. The air buzzed with repetition of the words Keanu had spoken. "If the Constitution can't be read by us, it's not a promise, it's a contract we never signed." A quote now printed on cardboard signs and hand-painted banners. A few young students had even wrapped copies of the Constitution in twine and held them in the air like torches. On social media, the reaction was instant and massive. Clips of Keanu standing calmly before the justices, holding Rosa's photo, flooded TikTok and Instagram. A video of him saying, "I'm not a lawyer, I'm a citizen who won't be silenced," had over 3 million views in under 2 hours. On Twitter, legal scholars and law school students battled it out in threads. Some praised his clarity, others questioned his standing, but everyone was talking. Blogs published think pieces before lunch. "The People's Constitutionalist," read one headline. "Why Keanu Reeves just taught a masterclass on civic duty," read another. Network news scrambled to air emergency specials. Legal commentators, left and right, sat stunned on split screens, agreeing more than they disagreed. A CNN anchor called it the most human moment the court has seen in years. A conservative outlet labeled it unorthodox, but undeniably effective. Despite the frenzy, Keanu was nowhere to be seen. He had exited the courthouse quietly through a side passage and walked without security, alone, down a quiet corridor of the Capitol District. No cameras caught him, no quotes were given. He passed unnoticed among tourists, keeping his head low and his pace steady. When he reached the hotel, he went directly to his room without stopping at the desk. The second he shut the door behind him, the noise of the world faded. He loosened his tie, sat at the desk, and opened the side pocket of his coat. Out came the photograph. Rosa Valdez, standing tall on the grass lot where her home used to be, smiling gently as if dignity had somehow survived what the system stole. He studied her face, not for answers, for grounding. Then, without warning, the phone on the nightstand buzzed once. Unknown number. Keanu stared at it for a moment, then answered. "Mr. Reeves," said the voice on the other end, smooth, controlled, familiar. "Chief Justice John Roberts." "I assume you've seen the reaction," Roberts said. Keanu remained silent. After a pause, Roberts continued, "Your presence caused more internal debate than any constitutional issue we've heard in the last 5 years." Another pause followed. Keanu said nothing, waiting. Then Roberts added something that surprised even him. "I'm writing the majority opinion," he said. "You may want to read it." Before Keanu could speak, the line disconnected. No explanation, no sign-off. Just that. The room stayed still. Keanu looked at the phone in his hand, then down at the photograph resting on the desk. Outside, sirens faded into the distance. The sound of DC was constant, but inside this room, it was quiet. The kind of quiet you only find after something irreversible. He nodded once to himself. A small gesture, but it meant everything. Outside his hotel, the world was still on fire. News outlets played loops of courtroom footage, debating Keanu's arguments and presence. A well-known constitutional scholar told MSNBC, he wasn't arguing from emotion, he was restoring the human dimension of law. A conservative analyst on another network admitted, I didn't want to like it, but the man made me think. Commentators on both sides agreed on one thing. This wasn't just a celebrity stunt, it had stirred something deeper. Across TikTok, creators stitched his speech into montages of American protest history. Law professors released impromptu video essays breaking down his proposed forfeiture test. Law school forums went wild with speculation. One headline read, "Will Reeves' framework become the new standard?" Underneath it, a quote, "Substantial connection, owner knowledge, public interest. 3 steps that might save 1,000 homes." Still, Keanu said nothing. He didn't check social media, didn't turn on the television. He sat in the quiet, holding Rosa's photo, listening to the muffled city sounds from behind the heavy drapes. For the first time in days, his body leaned back into the chair, not in relief, just stillness. The kind that comes when you've left everything on the field. A gentle knock came at the door. He opened it to find Maya. She stood in the hallway holding a small, rectangular package wrapped in brown craft paper, tied with string. "You left this," she said softly. Keanu took the bundle and stepped aside to let her in. They sat by the desk, the city still buzzing outside, invisible behind drawn curtains. He unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a framed copy of the First Amendment, aged, slightly worn, but legible in strong black print. She kept it on the wall, Maya said. After they took the house, she had it reprinted from the archives. She said it reminded her that even if she lost everything, she still had the right to be heard. Keanu held the frame in his lap, running a hand across the glass. "She would have been proud of today," Maya added. He nodded slightly, eyes fixed on the parchment. The words weren't just old script. They were a promise. And today he had tried to make that promise mean something. Again. "I don't know what happens next," he said finally. "You did what she couldn't," Maya replied. "You stood in front of them, and you made them listen." They sat in silence for a while longer. No words needed, just shared understanding. Eventually, Maya stood to leave. As she reached the door, she turned and asked, "If the decision goes our way, "What will you do?" Keanu looked at her and answered simply, "Read it." When the door closed behind her, he turned back to the window. He pulled the curtains slightly aside and looked down at the street. Flashing lights, students in sweatshirts quoting his speech, reporters still narrating history as it happened. He let the curtain fall shut again. Then he turned to his desk, picked up his pocket Constitution, and slid Rosa's photo into the front cover. This wasn't the end. Whatever Roberts was writing, whatever decision came down, it would only be the beginning of a larger fight. But for tonight, he could rest. Not because he had won, because he had been heard. And sometimes, in a country built on words, being heard is the first step toward justice. 3 weeks passed. In legal time, that was a blink. But for those watching the fallout from Henderson v. Department of Justice, every day felt like the breath before a verdict. Then, without warning, it arrived. At 10:02 IEM on a cloudy Thursday morning, the Supreme Court of the United States released its decision. 7-2. The petitioners had won. But it wasn't just the outcome. It was how they won. Inside the majority opinion, authored by Chief Justice Roberts himself, a new constitutional framework was introduced. From that moment on, all civil forfeiture cases would be required to meet a 3-part test. First, the state must prove the property owner had knowledge of the alleged crime. Second, the property must be shown to have a substantial and direct connection to that crime. Third, the state must demonstrate that public interest justifies the forfeiture beyond mere revenue generation. It wasn't theory anymore, it was law. Legal scholars around the country sat stunned as they read through the opinion. There, on page 28, a line stood out. "We are persuaded by the historical argument that civil forfeiture, as presently practiced, violates the intended balance between government power and individual liberty." Then came the surprise. Keanu Reeves was cited 4 times. His oral argument was quoted directly, twice, and in footnote 43, something unprecedented appeared. The amicus brief submitted by Mr. Keanu Reeves offered historical insight and constitutional interpretation of exceptional assistance to the court. "We acknowledge his contributions with gratitude." In legal circles, that kind of credit was reserved for law professors, senior litigators, and constitutional scholars. Keanu had no title, no law degree, no seat on any bench. But now, he had shaped constitutional doctrine. Justice Barrett signed on to the majority but issued a separate concurrence. In it, she agreed with the outcome, but declined to endorse the final section outlining broader state-level implications. Her language was careful, reserved, even cold. She didn't mention Keanu once, but her omission only fueled the reaction. Across the country, legal communities began issuing statements. The American Bar Association called it a landmark correction to decades of imbalance. Civil liberties organizations launched campaigns to support residents in reclaiming their seized properties. State attorneys general began holding emergency meetings to revise enforcement policies. And in one small town in Arizona, something extraordinary happened. Rosa Valdez got a phone call. It was short, direct, bureaucratic. "We're returning your home." No apology, no compensation. But the keys were coming back. Her granddaughter, Maya, cried when she heard. Rosa didn't. She just asked if she could repaint it yellow. 2 weeks later, Keanu Reeves stood on the cracked sidewalk in front of the small, single-story house. The paint was faded, the lawn was overgrown. A chain-link fence bent inward from years of neglect. But it was hers again. The moment was quiet. No cameras, no press. Just Keanu, holding out a set of keys. Rosa's hands trembled as she took them. She looked him in the eye, the same way she had decades ago when she'd taught night classes in American history to undocumented students. "This was never about me," she said softly. "I know," Keanu replied, "but I'm glad it started here." They stepped inside together. The house smelled like dust and memory. Rosa ran her fingers along the windowsill where sunlight now poured in. She turned to Keanu. "You didn't have to come all this way." He smiled gently. "Yes," he said, "I did." That evening, the legal world continued to reel. Law schools rewrote syllabi. Professors adjusted lectures to include the Reeves test. Students on campuses from Berkeley to Yale walked into class quoting his footnote. Late-night shows ran respectful monologues, shifting tone from mockery to admiration. Even skeptics began to concede that something remarkable had happened. A viral tweet read, "We laughed at the actor. The actor rewrote the rules." In state legislatures, the dominoes began to fall. Maryland passed a bill aligning with the new federal test within days. Illinois followed. In New Mexico, where Rosa's property had first been taken, the Attorney General released a public statement. "The law must reflect justice, not merely precedent. We welcome the guidance of the court and of the citizen who brought moral clarity to legal ambiguity." Meanwhile, Keanu remained silent. He didn't give interviews. He didn't post a reaction. Instead, he traveled. Quietly, he returned to the Library of Congress, spending 2 more days in the Jefferson Reading Room, this time not to prepare a case, but to study its consequences. He requested early drafts of civil asset laws. He pored over 19th-century critiques of postbellum seizure policies. He handwrote a few notes in his pocket constitution, this time not in the margins, but on a clean, blank page in the back. On the final evening before leaving Washington, he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Tourists passed by, not recognizing him. Others paused but said nothing. He stood there for nearly an hour, eyes fixed on the figure seated in stone above him. Then, quietly, he opened his jacket and removed the framed copy of the First Amendment Maya had returned to him. He placed it on the ground at the base of the monument, not as a symbol, not for anyone to see. Just a gesture, a reminder, a thank you. 3 days later, he flew home. Back in Los Angeles, his phone rang less. His name appeared in fewer headlines. The storm passed, but not the legacy. In small towns across America, ordinary citizens filed petitions using the new Reeves test. In Detroit, a father reclaimed his truck after it was seized for a crime he didn't commit. In Bakersfield, a pastor won back his community center's van. In Texas, a mother got her savings back after months of legal limbo. Each case cited Henderson v. Department of Justice. Each case traced back to a man who stood alone in a marble courtroom and dared to speak, not as a lawyer, but as a citizen. 1 month later, Keanu received a letter in the mail. It was hand-addressed, no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed Rosa Valdez standing proudly in front of her repainted house, bright yellow now, just as she'd promised. Next to her stood Maya, holding up a sign that read, "She belongs here." No message, just the photo. Keanu placed it beside the framed First Amendment on his desk. Somewhere, the debates would continue. Courts would dissect, scholars would dispute, laws would evolve. But the house was back in Rosa's name, and the Constitution, at least for now, felt a little closer to the people who needed it most. He looked at the photo one last time, then tucked it gently into the back of his briefcase. Not as a trophy, as a reason to keep going. The ripple became a wave. Within a month of the Supreme Court's decision, Keanu's words were no longer confined to courtroom transcripts or headlines. They had become part of the curriculum. Harvard Law School issued an announcement. A new seminar would be added the following semester titled Citizen Interpretation and the Reeves Doctrine. Stanford quickly followed, expanding its public policy track to include a module on the evolving role of civic voices in constitutional law. Georgetown held a symposium titled Voice Without Credentials, inviting scholars and students to dissect how one man had shaken the highest court in the land. At Yale, students held a roundtable on whether justice should be reserved for professionals or whether voices from outside the system were the very check the founders envisioned. And at NYU, a packed auditorium erupted into applause when a visiting professor read the footnote from the Supreme Court opinion aloud, not because it cited Keanu Reeves, but because it dared to acknowledge that truth can come from anywhere. The American Bar Association made it official. In their annual conference, Keanu Reeves was named Civic Advocate of the Year, not for his fame, not for any charitable donation, but for presenting a constitutional argument so clear, so grounded in the founding principles, that it reshaped national jurisprudence. They offered to fly him in, give him the stage. He declined, politely, graciously, then quietly turned down an honorary law degree from Columbia and another from USC. Then came the book deals, a scripted Netflix miniseries, even a documentary project with a 7-figure budget attached. He said no to all of them. "I didn't fight for attention," he said in a rare interview with NPR. "I fought for dignity. Theirs, not mine." The host asked if he regretted not becoming a lawyer. Keanu's reply was simple: "No. I became what I needed to be when I saw what was missing." The clip went viral. So did the story of his pocket constitution. The same annotated copy he'd held in front of the court, worn, weathered, stuffed with handwritten notes and ribbon bookmarks, was now the subject of requests from museums. The Smithsonian sent a formal invitation. Would he consider donating it for permanent display in the National Museum of American History? Keanu wrote back, "I'll lend it, but don't place it under glass. Let people turn the pages." They agreed. That fall, the Constitution sat in a custom-built case designed to allow limited, supervised interaction. Visitors waited in line for hours to flip through it, to read the underlines, the side notes, the margin quotes. Beside the exhibit, a sign explained its importance, but most didn't read the plaque. They just stared at the object that had helped shift a nation's legal course. At the grassroots level, the changes came quickly. Civil liberties groups established new partnerships with law schools. Clinics sprang up across the country under the name the Reeves Clinics, dedicated to helping vulnerable communities navigate property seizure claims. Students volunteered, professors mentored. One small town in Mississippi reversed 11 pending forfeiture cases after law students filed motions using the new standard. For journalists, the story was easy to frame. Justice outsourced. A citizen's doctrine. Proof that the system can still be shaken. But for Keanu, it was noise. Background movement to something deeper. Because while others analyzed what had already happened, he was staring ahead. He sat alone again in the Jefferson reading room. Not for praise, not for a photo op. The two read. He sifted through thick volumes of case law, records from immigration courts, and housing discrimination reports. A folder marked "Easement Abuse in Rural Counties" sat unopened beside him. The desk clerk, a student intern, recognized him but said nothing. Keanu appreciated that. Silence was a gift. He was already searching for the next fight. Injustice didn't live in just one form. It moved. It morphed. And after everything he'd witnessed, Keanu knew that what the court had ruled was just a beginning. Constitutional victory wasn't closure. It was permission to keep going. Back in Los Angeles, people still tried to reach him. Producers, politicians, law firms offering him consulting gigs on policy reform. Even a governor's office extended an invitation to co-chair a new commission. He thanked them all, then quietly declined. It wasn't ego. It wasn't martyrdom. It was purpose. He wasn't building a brand. He was building a path for others to walk through doors that had once been closed tight. Meanwhile, Rosa's house had become a local monument. Not in any formal way. There were no plaques or tours. But people drove by just to see it. Yellow now, bright against the dullness of the neighborhood. The community center down the street held a monthly civic forum named after her. Local teachers began assigning essays titled, "What Would Rosa Say?" And Maya? She started law school. Her admission essay was titled, "A Constitution in the Pocket of a Stranger." It made the rounds in academic circles, praised not just for its style but for its clarity. The final line read, "Somewhere, someone is waiting for justice. And maybe, just maybe, someone else is waiting to deliver it." Keanu read it in full one quiet night and smiled. He didn't reach out. He didn't need to. He had said enough. And still, the cultural shift kept expanding. A mural appeared in Oakland showing Keanu standing at the Supreme Court steps, not as an actor, but as a citizen, holding his pocket constitution like a torch. Underneath, the words, "Let the people be heard." On the East Coast, a high school civics teacher rewrote her entire course to follow the Reeves framework. She told her students, "You don't need a title to speak truth, you just need to do the work." A week later, one of her students won a local essay competition, arguing against school disciplinary seizures. She titled it Keanu's Rule. Even late-night comedy, which had once mocked him, shifted tone. One host held up the court ruling and said, "We told him he didn't belong in court. Turns out, neither did half our laws." The audience laughed, but the applause lasted longer than the punchline. As for Keanu, he didn't return to film. Not yet. He walked neighborhoods. He met with families. He showed up at community meetings unannounced, sitting in the back with a legal pad and a quiet focus. At one of them, someone finally asked what he was planning next. He looked up from his notes and said, "Listening." That was it. No campaign, no speech. Just a man with a pocketbook of old ideas, listening for the next place they might still matter. Behind the polished oak doors of her Supreme Court chambers, Judge Amy Coney Barrett sat in silence. The ruling in Henderson v. Department of Justice had been handed down weeks ago. The media storm had mostly passed. Yet something inside her refused to settle. The headlines hadn't helped. Critics on both sides dissected every word of the opinion. Some questioned her partial concurrence. Others noted her refusal to acknowledge Keanu Reeves by name. Even conservative commentators wondered aloud whether she had allowed personal pride to cloud a historic moment. But Barrett wasn't angry about the headlines. She was angry because she knew the truth. She had underestimated him. Not just as a speaker, not just as a public figure, but as a thinker. She had expected drama, performance, a celebrity spectacle designed to sway sentiment. Instead, she'd been met with originalist citations, footnoted arguments, and a deep reverence for the Constitution that rivaled her own. And that stung. For weeks, she avoided discussing it publicly. She focused on other cases. She refused interviews. But behind closed doors, reports leaked. Clerk said she had snapped during oral prep for an unrelated case. One aide overheard her muttering, "He quoted Madison better than I did." She hadn't slept well. At night, she found herself rereading the dissent from Bennis v. Michigan, the very case she had used to corner Keanu. Justice Stevens' words now struck a different chord, not because she had changed her stance, but because she now saw what he had seen. How dangerous the erosion of due process could be when dressed in procedural formality. She pulled out her own personal copy of the Federalist Papers. It was well worn, filled with margin notes from her early teaching days. Page after page, she traced the arguments she once lectured to eager students. But now, something new caught her attention. It was Madison again. A letter dated March 5, 1789. In it, he wrote, "It is not titles that grant authority, but the patience to listen and the will to reason." She set the book down. There was no denying it. He hadn't embarrassed her. He had educated her. And though she would never say the words aloud, she began to realize something deeper. He had honored the very principles she had sworn to uphold, even as she tried to push him aside. Months later, she surprised everyone. At the annual Legal Ethics Conference in Philadelphia, she walked in unannounced. The room fell silent. She rarely attended such events outside of official lectures, and never without prepared remarks, but this time she simply took a seat in the front row. No clerks, no cameras, just her and a legal pad. During the Q&A, a young professor asked about the Henderson case. Barrett nodded. "Important precedent," she said. Then came the follow-up. "What did you think of Keanu Reeves' role in shaping that decision?" The pause was long. Some attendees leaned forward. Others looked away, bracing for dismissal. Barrett tapped her pen once against the pad, then looked up. "Respect doesn't come from a title," she said. "It comes from preparation." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood. She had heard him, and more importantly, she had changed. After the conference, Barrett slipped out a side door, declining interviews. She returned to Washington without fanfare. But word of her remark had already spread. Legal blogs lit up with analysis. Former students posted reflections. One wrote, "It takes real humility to acknowledge someone you dismissed, especially in front of your peers." Still, she never issued a statement. There was no op-ed, no formal address, but her tone on the bench began to change. In a subsequent civil liberties case, she asked more probing questions about economic disparities. She pushed attorneys harder on the implications of judicial overreach. During one oral argument, she quoted Jefferson's phrase about the moral conscience of the republic, something Keanu had used in his own speech. Observers took notice. She had not become a different justice overnight. Her rulings still followed her judicial philosophy, but there was nuance now, more weight behind each question, more reflection in her pauses. Even her clerks sensed a shift. One day, a senior clerk approached her privately. "Justice Barrett," he said carefully, "I read the Henderson majority again." She looked up. The footnotes, the citations, they were airtight. She nodded. Then the clerk asked, "Have you ever considered teaching again?" She smiled faintly. "Every day." And that's when she made her quiet decision. That summer, she accepted a guest seminar position at her alma mater, Notre Dame Law School. It wasn't publicized. It wasn't recorded. She taught a class called Unorthodox Advocacy in the Constitution. 12 students were accepted. The first reading assignment, Keanu Reeves' amicus brief, published anonymously, but now archived in full. She didn't explain the choice. She let them read it, analyze it, dissect its structure. Midway through the semester, one student raised his hand. "Professor, do you think it's dangerous to let non-lawyers shape the law?" Barrett thought for a moment. "I think it's more dangerous," she said slowly, "to believe that only those with titles understand justice." The room went still. She wasn't quoting Keanu, but she didn't need to. Her syllabus shifted after that. She added more unconventional voices to the reading list: civil rights leaders, immigrant activists, even letters from wrongly convicted citizens who had studied the Constitution from prison libraries. Students began calling the seminar Barrett's Reckoning, though never in front of her. She never mentioned the man again, but everyone knew he was present in every page, every case, every pause between her words. Months later, during her last class, a student left a small envelope on her desk. Inside was a single page, folded carefully. It read, "Some truths echo longer when spoken softly." There was no name, just the quote. She kept it, not in her desk drawer, not in her office, of her briefcase, right next to her own copy of the Constitution. That evening, she walked alone through the quiet campus, past the old chapel, past the student courtyard where debates once raged. She paused beneath a lamppost and stared up at the stars. She hadn't apologized, but that didn't matter anymore, because growth, she now knew, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it entered the room as a man with no law degree, no robe, no credentials, just a voice and a cause, and the courage to use both. In Phoenix, the desert sun caught on fresh yellow paint. Rosa Valdez's house had been restored, not just structurally, but symbolically. A local group of volunteers, neighbors, students, and former tenants who had once feared eviction came together to repaint it. They picked yellow for a reason. It was Rosa's favorite color. Bright, warm, the color of hope. But that wasn't the only transformation. On the east wall of the house, facing the street, a mural had appeared. It showed Rosa standing tall, older, proud, her face lifted to the sky. In one hand, she held a folded piece of paper above her head, a pocket constitution. Behind her, a faded silhouette of her original boarded-up home served as the mural's backdrop, painted in grayscale. Below the image, in simple script, were 3 words: "We, the people." People came from across the city to see it, some to honor, some to ask questions, most to feel something. Teachers brought their students. Veterans stood in silence. Church groups prayed in front of it. Reporters arrived too, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone. Not Rosa, she had passed before the ruling, not Maya, who preferred to stay quiet these days. They were all hoping Keanu would show, but he didn't. When asked, the mural artist simply said, "He told us this wasn't about him." Still, he did know. Maya had sent him a photo of the mural just hours after it was finished. No caption, no explanation, just the image. Rosa forever, holding up the very document that had once failed her, and later saved her. Keanu printed the photo, trimmed the edges with care, and quietly taped it inside his briefcase. No frame, no inscription, just memory. The kind you carry with you, not to be seen, but to remind you why you walk. Across the country, other stories began to surface. In Chicago, a retired mechanic named Thomas got his workshop back after it was seized for zoning violations he didn't understand. In Georgia, a single mother named Latasha was reunited with the deed to her home after a clerical forfeiture was overturned. In Tacoma, a disabled veteran found a letter on his doorstep from the city attorney. "Your property rights have been reinstated." No press conference, no balloons, just change. City by city, county by county, the Reeves framework was taking root. Quietly, firmly. Judges cited it. Legal aid clinics argued it. Community boards referenced it. Local journalists told the stories behind it. And through it all, Keanu stayed away from the spotlight. He didn't attend the mural dedication. He turned down an invitation to receive an award from the Arizona State Bar. When NPR tried to schedule a follow-up interview, he politely declined. Instead, he walked, this time, through the neighborhoods of Newark, New Jersey. It wasn't for a film, or a cause, or an image. It was to listen. He sat in small parks where kids played and elderly men traded stories over chessboards. He visited corner stores, asked about business. He helped a mother load groceries into her car. No one asked for autographs. Most didn't recognize him without the cameras or the headlines. One evening, he showed up at a small brick church with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign that read, "Community Hall, Thursdays, 7 p.m. He took a seat in the back as locals gathered for their weekly town forum. He didn't speak at first, just watched, listened. Then, someone introduced him quietly. He stood and spoke. No script, no microphone, just his voice filling the small room lined with folding chairs and weathered hymnals. He didn't start with the court, or Rosa, or the ruling. He started with a question. "What makes something yours?" he asked. Silence. People looked at one another, unsure. Then he continued. "Is it a deed, a receipt, a title?" He shook his head softly. "I think it's the hours you spend keeping something alive. A home, a dream, a family. If you water the roots long enough, it's yours, no matter what the paperwork says." There was no applause. Not yet. Just stillness. He told them about a house in Phoenix, about a woman who was never on the news, about a girl named Maya who grew up thinking justice was for someone else, and how all of that changed because of a document written centuries ago, misused, misread, but never lost. He said, "The law is a tool, but dignity is the goal, and if the law forgets that, it becomes a hammer, used on the wrong people." A woman near the front began to cry. Not loudly, just one tear, down the cheek. No one reached for cameras, no one interrupted. He spoke about mercy, about listening, about why systems that forget names are the ones that collapse first. And then he said something that stuck with them long after he left. "We always say justice is blind, but maybe justice should see better. Maybe it's time she opened her eyes." The room didn't erupt. It breathed. People leaned in, some took notes, others just looked down, quietly rearranging what they believed. He ended with a story about a boy who watched his mother lose their house, not to violence, not to a fire, but to silence. To a letter she didn't understand, from a court she never entered. He said that boy grew up wondering if anyone would ever speak for people like her. Then he said, "Turns out, that boy had to learn to speak for himself." He stepped down from the pulpit and took his seat again. The moderator, stunned, whispered, "Do you want to stay for coffee?" Keanu smiled. "Only if there's no cream." They laughed, not because it was funny, but because the tension finally broke. Outside, the streets of Newark glowed under flickering streetlights. Cars passed. Somewhere, a dog barked. The world was still turning. But something had shifted in that small church basement. Not because of who he was, but because of what he reminded them. That dignity doesn't wear a robe. That justice doesn't live only in marble buildings. That sometimes it walks quietly beside you, carrying a taped-up photo in a beat-up briefcase, asking questions no one else dares to ask. Across the country, the mural in Phoenix kept drawing visitors. No plaques, no hashtags, just Rosa holding the Constitution to the sky. And beneath it, 3 words that no court could ever erase. We the people. Months had passed. The country had adjusted. New laws were in motion. Cities began reviewing old cases. Universities rolled out updated legal frameworks. The noise had quieted, but the message lingered. Then came the invitation. An annual legal symposium hosted at Georgetown Law, normally reserved for sitting justices, renowned professors, and constitutional scholars, made an unusual request. Would Keanu Reeves be willing to speak? Not as a celebrity, not as an actor, as an amicus, as a citizen. The organizers didn't expect him to accept, but they sent it anyway, just in case. To their surprise, he replied with a single line, "I'll be there." No script. The auditorium filled to capacity. Law students packed in, shoulder to shoulder. Judges, professors, legal historians, and even policymakers sat in reserved rows near the front. Security was tight, though Keanu had requested no red carpet, no private entrance. He walked in through the front doors like everyone else, wearing a black blazer and carrying the same briefcase. No fanfare, just footsteps. When his name was announced, the crowd applauded politely, some still unsure what to expect. He stepped onto the stage, paused, and looked out at the sea of faces. No notes, no teleprompter, just breath. Then he spoke. "The law isn't sacred because it's written," he began, his voice steady, low, but clear. "It's sacred because it's remembered." The audience leaned in. He didn't give them a lecture. He told them a story about the first time he read the Constitution cover to cover, about a library room where he sat under flickering lights for hours, about how he didn't understand every clause, but he understood every silence. He spoke of Rosa, of how laws written to protect were used to punish, of how ownership can be taken with ink instead of force, of how a home became a headline, and a headline became a turning point. The law, he said, is not just for the trained. If it cannot be understood by the people, it will never be for the people. Some students blinked back tears. He didn't preach, he invited them to look at the Constitution not as a relic, but a relationship, not as a shield for the powerful, but a promise to the unheard. When a child is afraid of a knock on the door, he said softly, because of a piece of paper written in a language her mother doesn't speak, the law is failing. The room was silent. He let it breathe. Then he added, "Justice isn't a destination. It's a duty." He spoke of preparation, of humility, of learning from mistakes, especially public ones. He referenced Judge Barrett's transformation without naming her. He quoted Madison again, but this time, he didn't read it. He remembered it. A government without compassion is not a republic. It is bureaucracy with a flag. The audience didn't clap. Not yet. They listened. He spoke for exactly 43 minutes. No filler, no repetition. Every word a choice. Every pause a point. And when he finished, he didn't thank them. He just stepped back from the podium and gave a small nod. Then he turned to leave. That's when the room stood. One by one, every person in that room rose to their feet. Some were slow, still absorbing what they'd heard. Others stood quickly, unable to hold back the emotion. But soon the entire auditorium was on its feet. Professors with decades of tenure, first-year students still finding their voice, federal judges, grassroots activists, and people who had spent their entire lives inside the legal system. No one clapped at first, they just stood. Then, somewhere near the back, a hand came together, and another, until the entire hall erupted into a standing ovation. But Keanu didn't raise his hand, he didn't bow, he didn't wave or smile for the cameras lined discreetly along the sidewalls. He simply walked off the stage. No one followed. No one needed to, because what he left behind wasn't a performance. It was a movement. That night, social media exploded again, not with memes but with quotes, snippets of his words, videos of law students crying in hallways, professors rewriting syllabi on the spot. One student tweeted, "This wasn't just a speech, it was a mirror." CNN called it the most unexpected legal keynote in American history. The New York Times ran the headline, "Citizen Advocate Rewrites the Rules of Legal Engagement." Law blogs debated whether his words would shift constitutional pedagogy for years to come. But by morning, Keanu was gone. He had boarded an early train back to the West Coast. No press, no entourage, just a man with a briefcase, a photo inside, and a mind already turning to the next place he might be needed. At Georgetown, they turned the transcript of his speech into a teaching text. Harvard and Stanford adopted excerpts for first-year courses. The American Bar Association issued a statement. "While not a member of our guild, Mr. Reeves has reminded us of the guild's purpose." And students all over the country, those who once saw the law as something far away, now saw it as something they could touch, question, and even shape. They called themselves Reevesians, not fans, followers of a mindset, a discipline, a humility that proved one voice, well prepared, could echo through walls built to keep it out. In cities across America, small law clinics popped up under the Reeves model. They served immigrant families, wrongly accused tenants, veterans caught in paperwork loops. They didn't charge fees. They didn't hang celebrity photos. They hung constitutions, and they listened. At one such clinic in Detroit, a young boy pointed at a photo of Keanu on the wall and asked his mother, "Is he a lawyer?" His mother smiled and said, "No, baby. He's just someone who remembered what justice sounds like." And that's how he wanted it. No statue, no honorary title, no closing credit. Just a ripple. And maybe, someday, a wave. Back in Los Angeles, the sun felt warmer than before. Not because the world had changed, but because Keanu had changed in it. He was on set again, this time filming a small indie drama. Nothing explosive, nothing loud. Just a quiet role in a story about forgiveness. The studio lights flickered, the director called for a break, and while everyone checked their phones or grabbed water, Keanu walked off to the corner of the lot and opened the back of his trailer. Inside was the same leather briefcase. Still taped inside was the photo of Rosa's mural. He sat down, not to study, but to breathe. He hadn't spoken publicly about the court case since the symposium. He didn't need to. Others were speaking now. Law students, teachers, volunteers at new clinics helping people keep their homes. Families that once felt erased now had documentation, guidance, and, finally, representation. Letters had started pouring in weeks after the ruling. Some were from professors, some from attorneys, but most came from people who never imagined the law could see them. One was from a janitor named Troy who worked nights in Minneapolis. His handwriting was rough, his words simple, but the message carried weight. "I used to think the law wasn't for people like me," Troy wrote. "You made me believe again. You made me believe it was mine too." Keanu stared at the letter for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and wrote back. "It always was, we just stopped listening." A soft knock at the trailer door broke the silence. The assistant director called him back to set. He folded the letter, placed it in the briefcase, and gently closed the latch. Later that evening, after shooting wrapped, he took a walk through a local high school where a friend taught civics. The hallway buzzed with leftover energy from a debate tournament. Students in ties and sneakers argued about taxes and surveillance. Keanu stepped into the small auditorium unannounced. His friend smiled and motioned to the stage. "They know who you are," he whispered, "but they don't know why you're here." Keanu didn't stand behind the podium. He sat on the edge of the stage, elbows on his knees. "I'm not a judge," he said. "I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not here to give you a speech." The students fell quiet. "I just have a question." He let the pause linger. "If you had 5 minutes," he said, "just 5 minutes in front of the Supreme Court, what would you say?" Eyes widened. Some scribbled in their notebooks, others froze, thinking. One girl raised her hand. "Would it matter?" Keanu nodded. "Yes," he said. "It matters more than you think." He talked to them about Rosa, about what one voice, one story can do when it's prepared, when it's truthful, when it refuses to stay quiet just because the room is full of titles. He told them that courage doesn't sound like shouting. Sometimes it sounds like pages turning at midnight, when no one's watching and no one's grading you. He said the Constitution wasn't a wall. It was a window. "Look through it," he told them, "and then open it for someone else." As he wrapped up, the bell rang. The students didn't move. No one wanted to be the first to leave. "Not yet." Keanu stood slowly and offered a quiet thank you, not for applause, but for presence. A teacher walked him out into the hallway. One of the students followed. She was small, maybe 15, with a spiral notebook clutched to her chest. Her eyes were full of fire, the kind that comes not from anger, but from awakening. "I think I'd talk about my grandma," she said, voice soft. "They took her car after an arrest that wasn't hers. She still hasn't gotten it back." Keanu listened. Then he asked, "Do you know why they took it?" She nodded. "Because they could." He nodded back. "Then maybe someday you'll be the reason they can't." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The idea had already taken root. Outside the school, Keanu sat on a bench and looked up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, the mural of Rosa still glowed yellow against a phoenix sunset. Somewhere else, an old court opinion was being read by a student who once thought the Constitution didn't belong to them. And in living rooms, courtrooms, and classrooms, a question now lingered. If you had 5 minutes in front of the Supreme Court, what would you say? Because in those 5 minutes, Keanu hadn't quoted a director or a politician or even a lawyer. He quoted Rosa. And Rosa, in all her quiet courage, had become the spark that moved the mountain. Keanu knew the world wouldn't change overnight. Not fully, not permanently. But maybe it would shift. Maybe 5 minutes could make someone feel like a citizen again. And maybe, just maybe, the next voice to speak would belong to someone who never thought they were allowed to. So now the question passes to you. If this incredible story moved you, share it. If you believe that truth can come from any voice, even yours, subscribe. And tell us in the comments. If you had 5 minutes in court, what would you say?